Welcome to the Echo Podcast, where we discuss how our hearts and minds can be an echo of God's heart and mind and what that even means in this world. We're Pastor Dan Sinkhorn and Adrienne Tarullo from Shiloh Church of Jasper, Indiana, and thanks for joining us on today's episode, where we continue our conversation about Frank Viola's book, Insurgence, Reclaiming the Gospel of the Kingdom. And so last week in the podcast, we did some exploration on the kingdom. We just talked about what the kingdom might be like, look like, feel like in the world around us, and we did some fun exploration there. And I encourage you to join us on today's exploration as we talk about what kingdom levers are. This is a concept that Frank brings up in the book. I'm not sure where, but somewhere in the book. And so it's a pretty intriguing concept, one that I have actually not encountered before. So this should be a fun episode where Pastor Dan is teaching me and you all about these levers. So we're titling today's episode, Small Levers, Big Kingdom. We hope that this is practical, hopeful, and encouraging for you. So, Pastor Dan, what is a kingdom lever, and what in the world does that mean for us?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Adrienne. So I have to admit that, like everyone else listening to this podcast, I've had opportunities to sleep and do other things since our last recording, and I have to admit that I came into today's podcast somewhat fuzzy, and I don't think that it would be fair to our listeners for me to not acknowledge that. So as I was thinking about where I thought we were going to go with this, and thinking about when I picked up Frank's book and read it last, which I have to admit isn't this morning, Now, the real professional podcasters, the really good ones, they would be better prepared than this.
Sure.
Or they would fake it better, But this is just a typical conversation between me and the wonderful members of my team here at Shiloh, and Adrienne and I often have this kind of discussion, and sometimes she can just ask me the most interesting questions, and then I just sort of scratch my head and I start making it up as I go until it starts to come together. And this may sound a little like that today. So all that to say that this idea of kingdom levers is really what we're doing now that the premise of the book is that there is this gospel of the kingdom that people are largely ignoring in our Christian world. They're making up a gospel that satisfies their particular way of interpreting, personal holiness or religious devotion or whatever you want to call it. So they've either followed a set of rules that they think that will make God happy with them, or they've decided God's already happy with them, so the rules don't matter. But then what we actually are aware of now because of this book study is that there's a kingdom that Christ has established, and he's inviting us to live there. He's inviting us to change our citizenship and our identity to the kingdom, and we literally have been interpreting it as though you change citizenship from one country to another, and if we decided, that we were going to move all of us, all the people that work here and our families and everybody we love, we all decided we were going to pick up and we were going to move to New Zealand. We'd say, well, how different can it be? They speak the same language we speak. But, then you get there and you find out that even though they speak the same language, they have a unique culture and they have values and they have an ideology for their national identity that is uniquely theirs. And while it's similar to ours, it's still not the same. I've had many Canadian friends over the years, and I really love my Canadian friends. But, once you get to know someone from Canada, you begin to realize that that's a different country up there. And it's a lot like America, but they value their unique identity, and they don't want to be compared to Americans as though they're just like us or something, any more than we'd want people to think that we're just like some other country that just happens to speak our language and drive on the same side of the road as us, So the whole point of this is that if we're going to move to a foreign country and we're going to declare ourselves citizens of that country, the idea would be that we would assume the identity of a person from that country. I don't know, I'm probably accidentally touching on a topic that's very hot in our country right now, but in my opinion, once you become a naturalized citizen of a country, then the assumption is that you will adopt the values and obey the laws and become, the same as other people in that country, at least in your own unique way, but you definitely have to do that when you set aside the world of your flesh and you adapt yourself to the kingdom of Christ. When you say, I'm going to be a Christian now, I'm going to see myself from the perspective of someone who's left the world of my flesh behind and moved to a new country, a country called Kingdom of Christ. And so this is the concept that we've been pushing through in this book. And now we're trying to imagine practical implications of that decision. And so I'm going to keep making this analogy just a little bit further. So should we decide that we're going to move to New Zealand, we would then have to learn the laws of that land. We would have to learn how to navigate their various practical things that they do differently from what we're accustomed to. So we would have to learn to drive according to their driving regulations and rules. We would have to learn to adjust to certain words having different meanings or certain uses of certain terminology that doesn't apply to us in our current lifestyle. And eventually we would have to adapt to things like weather and seasons. We'd have to learn to adapt to cultural norms, and a variety of little things would change every day in our life. And we would eventually become accustomed to those changes, and then we would be more able to gradually make greater changes. So when we think of terms of levers or leverage, right, we're trying to shift our direction and our centering from the world of our flesh and the culture of the flesh that is so natural to us, especially as Westerners. And we know that in order to move something, you need leverage, and in this case, you're talking about moving your identity. Now, for some of us, our identity in the flesh is no small object to move, and it's going to take a really good lever to move it. And so we think in terms of that basic principle that we learned in physical science in sixth grade, where to move something that is bigger than you got to use a lever or pulleys, but in this case, we're going to stick with the lever analogy. And that means that you're literally going to take a long rod or a pole or a board or something, and you're going to put it under the thing you're trying to move, and then you're going to put up a fulcrum that is going to give you the leverage you need to move this object.
Like a wheelbarrow.
Like a wheelbarrow, So first of all, we're talking about picking up and moving our identity and our perspective on all things and shifting it toward a kingdom perspective. And, that's no small thing. It doesn't seem like it was that long ago that you had come to me as a new member of this little Christian community, and you had some big questions. Mm-hmm. And you were having a struggle at that time with what was becoming clearly to you a better understanding of your Christian worldview and how it conflicted with your worldly, fleshly worldview. And you were asking me to help you see more clearly what the Christian perspective was.
Yeah.
So that was a moment where you were using me like a fulcrum to lever your old way of thinking out of the place where it was so that it could be moved closer to the kingdom. Now, you didn't see it as that at the time, and we wouldn't have had this discussion 6 or 7 years ago. But now,
sorry, you did the 6-7 thing. I can't help it. Continue, please. It happens.
For the record, I could care less about the 6-7 thing. I have no idea why that's a thing, and I don't care.
It's okay. Kids don't know either.
Nobody
understands.
Totally unaware of the fact and don't need to become aware. So anyway, you came to me those many years ago with this problem of perspective that you wanted to resolve, and you thought maybe I could help you. And it turned out that I was part of God's leverage in your life to shift you from this old way of thinking to a new way of thinking. So that's the first thing that happens. So the question then is, okay, so you're buying this insurgence view and you're accepting the fact that you didn't see Christianity exactly the right way when you were looking at it from this libertine point of view or from this legalistic point of view. Now you're beginning to see Christianity could be something entirely different. It could be an entire identity that's built around a kingdom or a world outside of the temporal perception of things, where God's ideology and Jesus's reign is supreme, and that we just want to continually conform ourselves to that. And you realize that it's a whole lot of baby steps. It's a whole lot of little adjustments, but it usually starts with one big kind of, I don't know, I picture something stuck in the mud and you kind of have to use a lever to get it out, and there's this pop, and then finally this sucking gives way and it finally moves, and that's, a lot of people are sucked into the world. They're stuck in this temporal worldview, this world of the flesh, and all the messages are everywhere around them telling them that this is normal. And then someone comes along and says, well, what if this isn't normal and we just haven't seen what normal really looks like? There's a movie from, many, many decades ago, it seems now, that was called The Matrix, that was all about that. What is the perception? What if the reality isn't the reality and it's actually just an image, and that the reality is far different? And that's sort of what it means to have your worldview upset and levered out of its socket so that you can finally start to move toward the kingdom. Okay, so now I'm going to take leverage in a different direction. I'm going to take levers in a different direction. So every one of us has got something on our wall in our house that is a lever. It's called a light switch. Now, some have little paddle type things, and some have knobby things that are like the one I'm looking at right now that is a lever. It's a switch. And this lever literally shifts the contacts inside the light switch from a position that is in alignment with the energy source to not in alignment with the energy source. And if you want light, you have to flip the switch or flip the lever so that it is in alignment with the energy source, and then you get light. Well, being a preacher who loves to make sermon illustrations, I suddenly see in my picture of this lever in action the very thing we're talking about. Enlightenment comes from a small action of a lever that suddenly awakens you to the reality of the kingdom of Christ. And these small actions, each one in their own way, lights your path toward the center of all things, which is the kingdom. Excuse me. So you're moving toward the kingdom, or deeper into the kingdom, let's say. So if I'm going to stick with the big lever got you out of the world and into the kingdom, but now you're trying to move toward the center of the kingdom, and each lever throws a switch that lights your way and moves you closer to the source of all light, the love of Christ. And, I don't know if you've ever been in one of these places that has the motion sensing lighting, and you're walking down the hall and it keeps lighting the path ahead of you, and it's supposed to save energy and everything. It's a little creepy, but at the end of the day, it's a good analogy for what we're talking about, except that you're the one turning on the switches as you go. And so, again, what are these little things? So we've talked about the big things, but what are the little things? And you sort of lived this. What are the little things that have continually moved you closer to the heart of Christ and to the center of things? You really didn't make major leaps and bounds. You did in the beginning because you said, oh my gosh, I've been thinking about this all wrong. Big lever moment. Mm-hmm. But then there's all these little levers. And now I'm going to throw in the last of my analogies. And this is the one that's my favorite because I grew up loving trains and I never grew out of it, So I picture train tracks. And when you want a train to go from one track to another, you have to throw a lever that causes the tracks to switch direction. And if you do that enough, you can make a train that was going straight north turn and go due east. If you keep throwing switches, eventually you can take a whole mile-long train and move it in an entirely new direction, but you have to do it through a series of switches. You can't just, you don't make a train take a hard right. It has to happen gradually. It has to shift its way through this sort of snaking procession of switches. And each of those requires a lever. And so the Christian journey, while for many people it will have these great dramatic moments that they like to talk about. And I don't mind those stories, but we've talked about this in my Insurgence class, so Adrienne is talking with the teenagers about the Insurgence, and I'm talking with the older adults about the Insurgence. And in my class, what I keep telling them is, my story doesn't have a singular dramatic moment of change because it's been a long walk with Jesus almost from the day I was born. I've just been very blessed to have always had a sense of God's presence in my life. And I've always had this sort of searching nature of constantly moving toward God. And it doesn't mean that I'm holy or anything because I know too much about myself, and I know people who are way holier than I am. But I've not got this dramatic turning point story. I don't have a big moment. But then there have been these times when I've been stuck, and it took some real leverage to get me unstuck. And so it's been, for me, this gradual journey of constant direction changes. And occasionally you come upon a mountain or some sort of big obstacle that requires you to do a little switchback, where you walk sideways for a while, gradually climbing the obstacle. And then you have to turn and go in the exact opposite direction and walk sideways some more to gradually zipper your way up to the top of the obstacle so that you can get over it. And the obstacle could be, a bad relationship, a bad job, or a move, or a hurricane, or a tornado, or the sudden death of a loved one. I mean, there are many, many things that happen in our lives that become these big obstacles. But for most people who walk with Christ and have even a little trickle of the Holy Spirit running into them, these are never dead stops or reversals. They're just slow down moments. And always it requires the shifting, the levering from one position to another. And that's really what it means to enter into the kingdom, to become, sort of we use the word insurgent, but we're not really yet to the place where we're talking about the true meaning of insurgency. And it's because, in a Christian life, you have to reach a certain point where you're so radically different from what you used to be or from what the people around you are that there is no mistaking the fact that you are no longer a citizen of this country. you're not even in the kingdom as an expatriate of your old country. You literally have adopted the new country as your home. And now when you go back into the world around you, that is your old country, you're sort of familiar to everybody. You're not unlike our Canadian analogy. People from Canada can walk around in cities in America and rarely be identified as non-Americans until you get to know them. And then you start listening carefully to what they say and how their values are informed. And you begin to see that they're not from here, that they do have this nature that is uniquely born of their citizenship in a country that is adjacent to ours, but not like ours 100%. So I think these are just, I'm drifting back and forth from analogy to reality, but the point I'm trying to make is that to act like a citizen of the kingdom may not make you look like an insurgent right away, but it will definitely make you look like you don't live here anymore. And that's improvement. That's levering your way closer to the kingdom. There's I've mentioned a few times recently that I like these sea stories, and I listen to these novels about the sea captains of the old sailing ships and everything. You know what they do when the wind won't take the boat the direction they want it to go? They do something called warping. They literally throw an anchor out, and then they pull the ship toward the anchor. They literally reel in the anchor to drag the ship towards it. So in other words, you're trying to get your ship to go to the dock where you want it to land, and the wind isn't cooperating. So what you do is that you literally will take an anchor and drop it so that you can't keep drifting away from where you want to go, and then you pull yourself toward that. And then you put that anchor on a boat and you have men row the anchor out closer to the place you want to go and drop it again. And then you reel the boat closer to the anchor. And then you put that anchor on a boat and have the men row it closer to where you want to go and drop it. And then you reel in the anchor until you get closer to where you want to go. It's a very tedious and hard labor to do this, but it works. It gets the boat where you want it to go, even when the wind isn't blowing you in that direction. And so there again, we're looking at this analogy of moving towards something using leverage, or in this case, pulleys, but it's still the same idea. It's still about creating mechanical energy that takes you in a direction that doesn't logically want to happen. So how did we do?
I think we're good on the lever concept. I think we got it.
Do you think I killed it dead?
I think it could be beneficial to go into like some practical, tactical, what are some actual levers that we can use to literally pull ourselves closer to the kingdom.
Okay.
Maybe daily, maybe, I don't know, weekly. There was a sentence here on the paper, and it says, if I could find it, says the kingdom advances more by faithfulness than by fireworks. And I like that a lot. And I think that was an idea that we were dancing around, both in the sea story with like the anchors pulling closer and closer, and then also how some people have like a mountaintop faith experience, right? That would be kind of like a firework. But it says the kingdom advances more by faithfulness than by fireworks. And so we went through a million analogies, and I had one also as like, I'm imagining there's a big pile of dirt and you have to move this pile of dirt. And it takes a big lift to decide that you're going to lift this pile of dirt, but it's a bunch of small steps.
Yeah.
It's a bunch of small transfers and small things and faithfulness and dedication to move this pile from one place to the next.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering about how that might look practically like in our faith. I know Frank goes through some specific types of levers in the book. So I didn't know if maybe we could explore that a little bit.
Well, I'll draw on something that we talked about on Sunday, referencing loosely another thing that Frank had written, but it has to do with changing the narrative. Like small steps of faithfulness look like this. You interpret a situation differently and you acknowledge that. You know, it's a practical, tactical approach to rethinking your worldview. You know, I mentioned a couple weeks ago that one of the big goals really for me as a pastor, and I'd say it's my number one goal, is to help people change their worldview from the flesh to a biblical Christian worldview. So in other words, you interpret events differently. You interpret the world you see differently. You can, we did this a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about how the world looks so different because it was covered in almost 2 feet of snow. And we were just talking about like from a Christian point of view, you look out there and you go, this is a picture of what it means to be as white as snow. This is a picture of the world where all of the ugly brown death and decay that is natural during the winter season around here is covered with this blanket of white purity, you know, and it's bright and it's glorious and it's clean and it's crisp. And you know, that's a subtle but very significant change in the narrative. That's a Christian worldview shaping right in front of your eyes. You read the weather differently. You look at the environment differently. You go home and you cuddle with your cat or your dog and you begin to interpret that this experience is reminiscent of something you read in scripture. You know, you you feel the movement of that baby in you that's going to come out soon, and you interpret that experience differently because you're a Christian. And these are the small, subtle changes. These are the movements of a little bit of the dirt at a time, because you interpret a lot of other things differently. You find yourself in a challenging situation because you're at odds with another human being and you're trying to figure out how to invest in this relationship and how to manage the conflict that you're experiencing with them. And you're interpreting it through a Christian lens. You're trying to think like a Christian. And you're saying to yourself, okay, well, as a Christian, how do I find the grace to forgive, but the wisdom to avoid further injury, you know, and how do I balance that, you know? And then you say to yourself, well, you know, Jesus said, go into the world as gentle as doves, but as wise as serpents, you know? So it turns out that a serpent's got to be pretty careful because everybody wants to kill snakes for some reason. There's people out there that really like them, but most of the people I know, if they see a snake, they want to run in the other direction, and so does the snake. So it's not a positive picture. Meaning that when Jesus says you should be as gentle as a dove and as wise as a serpent, he's saying, have all the grace and the mercy to forgive, but also be smart, you know, look out, because there's danger out there, you know, and that's not the point of this lesson, but to say that is what happens when your worldview changes. Is you start to see things differently. You start to hear things differently. You watch the news and you hear about trouble in the world, and you hear about protests, and you hear about people's judgments of others' actions and their words. And you say to yourself, well, I don't see it that way. Well, of course you don't, because you started thinking like a Christian, because the Holy Spirit has started to inform your thinking. And so you're gradually absorbing the culture of your new kingdom, and you realize that you don't interpret that the same way anymore. You know, so we have danced around it, but it really is as simple as that the first thing that happens is that you change the narrative. You just change the way you look at things, the way you speak to things, the way you hear things. And, you know, to me, the number one indicator that you are becoming a citizen of the kingdom of Christ is that your capacity for love grows exponentially. And you begin to interpret love in a way that is not limited to the sort of love that we most often talk about in our flesh world, which is erotic love or the kind of love that is associated with physical relationships between men and women and people who want to be, romantic with one another. And that's the only kind of love the world seems to know how to talk about. And yet, as your capacity for love grows from the Christian perspective, you begin to feel all different kinds of love for people and for creation and for God. And so when we were talking last week about just being enamored with the beauty of the King, it was because you're beginning to reflect his love. And his love is bouncing off of you and reflecting on everything around you like the moon, and so these are the subtle signs that you are progressing, these are the levers that are gradually being flipped and switched.
Yeah, one perspective that I'm sitting here thinking about is like when someone hurts you in some way. Emotionally, physically, whatever. If somebody hurts you, I think the worldview of that is, well, get them back, hurt them back. We were actually talking about this a little bit in small group last night. Someone was talking about how, a kid was annoying another kid, and the mom of the other kid was like, well, show him who's boss,
Mm-hmm.
let him have it. And I think that's the whole eye for an eye thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we know that makes the whole world blind, right? But from the Christian perspective, if someone hurts you, Jesus tells us to give them grace, right?
Yeah.
Treat them with love. Pray for those who persecute you. I mean, that is a total perspective change. And, it happens in small doses, kind of like moving that pile of dirt. It's not like one day suddenly you decide I'm a Christian and now I can just go ahead and give grace to every single person who hurts me. And it's an easy thing to do, right?
Yeah.
It's a process and it's a growth mindset, I think, of just celebrating those inches of growth of like, oh, well, I didn't, unleash my fury on this person
Right.
when they hurt me so badly like I really wanted to. Instead, I was maybe distant or whatever. There's very small steps you can take, but with time, your love does grow. And if we keep hearing that same message of, pray for those who persecute you, give grace to those who hurt you. And if we constantly try to internalize that, slowly with time, that change does happen.
Mm-hmm.
And to the point where someone hurts you, they know that they hurt you, and yet you treat them with love and kindness, and they're like, what? What are you doing? You're different. You're
Mm-hmm.
different. How so? What is going on here?
Yeah.
Right? And that's that difference in person and character. Like we were talking about earlier, it's a totally different, country of people, kingdom of people. So that's one example that I can think of.
Yeah.
As we're talking about it.
I think you've said something really powerful there. And I would say that you've described something that's very practical, down to earth, and that what I would say is that over time, you begin to eventually recognize in yourself that there are certain things you just don't even care about anymore.
Yeah.
That you don't even take offense at the things that you used to take offense at. That you talk about somebody hurting you or someone offending you or someone somehow, letting you down and how you respond to that. But when you've really worked your way closer to the center of the kingdom of Christ, you don't even notice those offenses anymore because they're not offensive to you. And I would say that as you get even closer to the center of things, you even recognize certain offenses and certain injuries as an expression of pain and grief in a person's life. And instead of actually being offended by them, you actually pity them. You actually feel sorry for them.
Mm-hmm.
And you ache for them. But there's that. Gentle as doves and as wise as serpents, because even when I pity and feel sorry for a person and don't take offense at what they're doing, I still have a certain responsibility to protect them from themselves, to protect myself from them, to protect others from them. But that's a very challenging thing too, because from the Christian perspective in the kingdom, it's kind of like if we're talking about this foreign country analogy, it turns out they have law enforcement in every country, and even in the kingdom of Christ, there's law enforcement. Now, we're not the law enforcers, but we are subject to the law, right? And so in the kingdom of Christ, we're thinking differently about everything. We're looking at everything in a very different way, but we're still living in a kingdom where there is a ruler and the rules are meant to be followed. And the difference is that we're not condemned to hell because of our inability to consistently follow the rules. That's the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ. But we are still meant to follow the rule or the yoke of our master, who is Jesus Christ. And, that comes with responsibilities and it comes with consequences when that doesn't happen. So we never really escape, even in the kingdom. It's not a place of bliss in the sense that there's never offense. So there's never, because we're people in development, because each one of us is somewhere along the way to the center of the kingdom.
Yeah.
And it seems like I can't go a week without mentioning that book that I have enjoyed for years now by C.S. Lewis, The Great Divorce, because he describes this person while he describes himself, moving slowly towards the center of heaven. And as he's moving along, he's encountering people who are stuck in different places along the way, and the reasons that they're stuck. And it's because they're still holding on to their humanity. They're still holding on to their flesh. Mm-hmm. And even though they're moving closer to the center of all things, they're still finding themselves in moments where they're stuck. And this is the reality, I think, of navigating our way towards the heart of the kingdom of Christ in a fallen world, is that we're going to encounter other Christians along the way who believe enough to be in the kingdom, but they still have a lot to learn, and they may notice the same thing about us.
Yeah. I like that you took the whole being hurt by someone else thing one step back. I liked that a lot because I started asking myself, like, okay, why do we experience hurt? Right? Like, obviously someone punches you in the face, that's going to hurt. But that's not really the hurt that I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about like emotional hurt.
Right.
And so I've had points in my journey where I've experienced some hurt from someone, and it takes, I think, honesty and self-discipline to take a step back and ask yourself, why am I hurt by this?
Mm-hmm.
What's the heart of the matter here? And you know what it almost always boils down to is pride.
Mm-hmm.
Almost always. Oh, I'm hurt because I thought this about myself and they, attacked my character in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a big change as Christians, is we are trying to, I guess, minimize pride in a way. Like, we're trying not to act on it or to live our lives based on pride, because we know that Christ is the center and we're seeking him. And I think pride is one of those things that can just get in the way so quickly and so easily. And so, the word that we talked about a few weeks ago, what is it where we talked about the military tactic where you shovel under the thing? Undermining.
Yeah.
I guess, is that what I was getting at? I don't know. Anyway, it can be sneaky like that, where it's kind of operating under the surface, and you can't realize it until you're just honest with yourself and you take a moment of reflection.
Yeah, I think you make a really great point. And to me, pride and fear are kind of like two sides of the same coin, because pride is a state of being where we want to be perceived first by ourselves and then by everyone else as being superior. Pride says, I'm better than you. Pride says, you all are beneath me, that I'm better than you. But what all pride really boils down to is a fear of not getting something you want. That you want to be better than everybody else because then that means you have everything. That if you have the nicest house in town because of pride, then the assumption is that no one has a better house than you. The assumption is that if you're proud because, you've gained the upper hand in this relationship with another person and they can't argue with you, more often than not, they might just be undermining your pride because they've just made up their mind it's not worth arguing with you. And so what you're proud of is actually something that they mock you for, that you may walk away thinking, well, they just don't have an argument that'll stand up to me. And so they don't argue with me because they always know that I'm right. And that's what you walk around thinking. But what's really happening is they've decided that it's not worth it to argue with you, and so in effect, they've dismissed you. They've done more harm to your pride than you have gained because of your pride. Because if it was all about feeling superior to someone else, then what you really end up with is people who actually look down on you and they don't even think it's worth arguing with you or trying to convince you of anything. They've just they've just dismissed you. So when I talk about fear and pride being essentially the same thing, I think because more often than not, pride is entirely about winning the approval of other people. It's always about the world. It's always about the flesh. And so when you find yourself at odds with others, it's usually because they have tapped into a fear. Now, that's the thing, talking about C.S. Lewis. He was a veteran of World War I, and he spoke a lot about what he'd learned in that conflict. And what he said was look, when you're in the trench and someone is shooting at you, you have a very good reason to be afraid. They're trying to kill you. And yet, he said, should that enemy and I kill each other, we'd probably still be sitting in the same pub in heaven having a beer together because I didn't hate him and he didn't hate me. We were just trying not to get killed by the other guy, And so what he was saying was fear is a very logical response to danger. But what more often than not occurs in our lives is that we have irrational fears that lead to pride, that lead to protecting our turf and protecting ourselves from imagined pain, right? And so you're right. You can be offended by someone or wounded by their actions or their inactions, and you can read meaning into what they did or did not do based on what you're the most afraid of, And if it turns out that you're really afraid that you can never depend on somebody to be, 100% for you, no matter what, then gradually you start to develop this mindset that, you can't entirely trust people, that sooner or later they're going to let you down. And then when they start to give these little hints and signs that you've been protecting yourself for generation, oh, here it comes, and then you start centering your life around not letting that pain get you. And then it ends up putting you at a distance from the people around you. And, that's a complicated thing and it's a bit of psychology, but see, it boils down to this. In the kingdom, if we're all moving toward Christ, we're not moving toward our own interests. We're not like in the kingdom, if we're all making our way towards the center of everything, which is Christ, then your progress doesn't really have anything to do with mine. And the truth is, if we're walking together, all the better, and you don't get a prize for getting there before me because, that would actually set you back. Mm-hmm. I tell you what, read, I'm obsessed with that book. I'm obsessed with that book. I haven't had a book that has influenced my thinking quite like that one. But it doesn't, there's a picture in The Great Divorce of this guy that realizes that the apples are solid gold on the trees. And so he tries to get one. And when he finally grabs it, it's too heavy for him and it just falls to the ground because he can't hold it. And the imagery is meant to convince us that this is because he hasn't grown into the identity that would be entirely his in the heavens, in the kingdom. In other words, once you're closer to the center of things, you can pick up the apple and hold it. But when you're not close enough to the heart of Christ, you're still not strong enough to pick up the golden apple. In fact, on the outskirts of the kingdom in this story that Lewis tells, you can't even walk on the grass because it hurts your feet. And that's because you have to gradually become conditioned as a citizen of the kingdom to be able to really live into the environment that is the kingdom.
Conditioning. That's a concept.
Yeah. And I think, to me, we're still talking about levers.
Yeah.
Because conditioning is the same sort of thing, right? You do, in addition to being our magnificent youth leader, you are also a physical therapist, and you use mechanical devices to help people condition. You help them restore movement in their bodies. You help them to grow strength in their muscles and their joints. And a lot of times you use levers to do that. You use machines, and sometimes they're really simple machines. They just pivot.
Can I blow your mind for a second?
Yeah.
The human body is just a system of levers.
It is.
A bunch of different kinds. I had to learn all about them. Levers A, B, C.
What's really amazing about our Creator is that He's given our bodies abilities that we can't reproduce in machines.
Yeah.
Because I could do things with my arm that you can't do with the machine unless you have extra cables and pulleys. It's crazy.
It's amazing.
Our bodies are fearfully and wonderfully made, it turns out.
Mm-hmm. The more I learn about the human body, the more I know for certain that God has created us.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is just such a miracle. It's amazing, truly. So, listener, I guess a good takeaway from today's episode is think about your life. What does it look like? And where are you on your journey towards the kingdom? Because we're all on the journey. If we weren't on the journey, we'd be in heaven, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're all walking this path. And I wonder, what is one small lever that you could pull this week to get you just a little bit closer to the kingdom of heaven? Maybe just one more wheelbarrow full of dirt as you try to move that big old pile of dirt from one spot to the next.
That's good.
I don't know what that looks like for you, but if you'd like to talk about it, we're here.
Yep.
Send us a message. Come into one of our offices. Shoot us an email. Something.
There you go.
Yeah. Not that we're the experts on anything. Pastor Dan's more of an expert than I am.
I'm just older.
More experience. Yeah. But
yeah, let us know what you're thinking and, be nice. The internet world is full of not nice people, but, be nice. We're just nice people trying to sort these things out. And, we would also love to hear from you if you're listening from some foreign land, because it turns out that wherever you are, we're all headed for the same kingdom, but we can learn a lot from each other. But I would thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
bye.